It seems like yesterday I was doing something on the Flexi Wings debate because of what McLaren and Mercedes have been doing sort of around the Belgian Grand Prix or so. And there's two things I really love about Formula One. Number one is the engineers and the designers' way of looking at something and managing to find a way around it, like some sort of aerodynamic spidey sense. And the other part is how the general public on social media can just assume that because a team is doing something that their team isn't, that other team is cheating. Like I said, Flexi Wings was the topic of discussion last time I looked into all of this, because as has been explained numerous times on this channel over the last 4 or 5 months, McLaren have gone from being barely in the top 8 or 10 and only scored 17 points in the first few races or so, to serving up one hell of a Hail Mary on the development front to bring, at least by F1 terms, a brand new car for the Miami Grand Prix. A car that allowed Lando to win the race, even if he did get a little lucky with the whole safety car stuff. But in future races, McLaren have been in race-winning contention at Imola, Austria, Silverstone, Belgium and Monza, while taking further victories in Hungary, Zandvoort and last time out at Baku, with Lando demolishing Verstappen in his own back garden at Zandvoort, and Oscar soaking up all that pressure from Charles and Checo in Baku to take what I'm assuming people are calling his first real win, given the absolute shower of team orders that happened at Hungary. But while many, including myself, have praised Oscar for his Oscar-worthy performance, the internet has been awash in the last couple of days of allegations of cheating on McLaren's part. Onboard shots from Oscar's car showed that when the car was below a certain speed, the rear wing looked totally kosher, but as the speed increased, it seemed that a small hole appeared in the wing, and that is thought to have given Oscar enough of a straight line boost that he was able to keep Leclerc behind easier than any of the other cars would have done. The DRS, as we've seen at Baku over the last, 8 years or so, can be incredibly powerful. So if there's a way of helping to counteract the advantage the trailing car has, the better. Let's say that a legal McLaren would be able to do a, arbitrary number, 190 miles an hour. Charles' Ferrari would be doing 202 from the DRS. That's a 12 mile an hour difference between the two cars. But with this trick rear wing, Oscar's now able to do 192 miles an hour to Charles' 202. It's a small difference in terms of a speed boost on Oscar's part, but the gap between the two cars' top speed has come a little bit closer, so it can be just enough to stop the other car getting by. So the question is, how does this work? For this, I need to refer to the previous Flexi Wing TM explanation, debate, discussion, whatever you want to call it, because it's assumed that McLaren and Mercedes have both got something happening on the front, as well as the rear in McLaren's case. It's believed, due to protests and requests for clarification sent in by Red Bull and Ferrari, that McLaren and Mercedes have rigged their front wings up in such a way that below a certain speed, the front wing flaps are totally legal and are at, again, a number pulled out of thin air, 12 degrees. Above a certain speed, it starts to flatten out, and that wing is now 10 degrees, 9 degrees, however much they've got it bending. This reduces front end drag and will give the two cars a straight line boost. With McLaren looking like they've got something similar at the rear, they've got double DRS all the time above, again, arbitrary number, 150 miles an hour. The protests were filed by Red Bull and Ferrari because the FIA says that the wings cannot flex beyond 3mm with 60 Nm of force applied. The thing is, when the car is out on track, it's producing enough downforce for the car to run upside down on the roof of a tunnel, and will weigh over 2 tons with all of that downforce going over it. There's going to be a lot of downforce applied to the aero, and as discussed in the previous video, stuff is going to be bending and flexing as it goes over bumps, bounces off curbs, and so on. If they were as rigid as you could possibly get them and as stiff as you could possibly get them, they're likely to snap from all of the force. You need to spread it out across the wing to make sure it doesn't, snap. There has to be some give in them. It's a weird rule that I think a lot of people have got the wrong end of the stick over. See Mercedes at Monza a few years back, which is also a video I did recently. The FIA took tyre pressures from cold tyres and said that Hamilton and Rosberg were under pressured and might be in trouble. But Pirelli took the hot pressures in the tyre blankets because that's more indicative of race running. And because Hamilton and Rosberg were above Pirelli's minimums while out on track, while the tyres were up to temperature and under load, they avoided any punishment. So the big question is, was McLaren cheating at Baku? And have they been cheating all this time? Because if Red Bull were cheating with this rumoured asymmetric brake pedal stuff, then McLaren has to be cheating too, right? Or am I just going to say that McLaren aren't cheating because it's a British driver and a British team and Red Bull bad? But the thing is, not once in any of the videos I've made since Red Bull started their downfall, McLaren came through to the front, and Mercedes and Ferrari started making their way back forward, have I implied that Red Bull were cheating. Like I've said before, flexing wings have been a point of contention for a while, because they have to flex to be safe with those loads on them, the same way that a large airliner can look like it's flapping in heavy turbulence. A Boeing 787's wings can flex to around 8 meters, which is the length of a killer whale for those that refuse to get with the program and divide by 10. In 2021, flexi wings, TM, became a subject of discussion as both Red Bull and Mercedes accused each other of using them to gain an unfair advantage. The FIA then stepped in and changed Article 3.9 of the rules. Even though that ban came in for the French Grand Prix, Red Bull was still allowed to use the wing that they had been using up until the Turkish Grand Prix, because the thinking was they didn't have a legal one to use, so they had to manufacture one, and that was going to take time. So it's kind of a weird thing that they've been banned from using this particular wing, but you're allowed to keep on using it until you can make a legal one. Yeah, the FIA works like that sometimes. It also has to be said that the FIA, in recent races, has put more cameras on the cars to help identify who is really taking the piss with any bendy boy wings that they might have fitted to the cars. The last race for these is supposed to be at Singapore this weekend, so everybody will have run a camera at some point. And in 2021, the FIA asked the teams to run those dots that you might have seen on the cars to help police matters. Some of you that know past controversies will know that Hamilton was disqualified from qualifying in the Brazilian Grand Prix of 2021 due to having an iffy DRS flap, but this was slightly different to what was seen on Oscar's car at the weekend. Essentially, Hamilton's flap opened too much, beyond the regulations set out by the FIA, so he was dumped to the back of the field. It was like a millimetre or something along those lines. It might have been less than a millimetre, so we're talking tiny amounts. But if the rules say that it can only open a certain amount, then the DRS can only open a certain amount. Hamilton has gone beyond what was legal, either because the thing had failed or Mercedes had screwed up somewhere along the line, and it was back of the grid with him. But it's not like Oscar was driving around Baku with a massive hole in his rear wing. Quite the opposite. It was incredibly subtle, and you had to really be looking to notice. As his car's speed increased, the wing's plane deformed and flattened out, making the gap between the closed rear wing and the rest of the assembly slightly larger. As Matt Summerfield at motorsport.com noted in his explanation piece about all of this, the FIA must have been fine with it because the cars were going through inspection after every session and every race, assuming they've run it before, and so far nothing has come back about Oscar or Lando being under investigation or even being thrown out of the race for having an illegal car. I made the mistake of reading the comments on that article on motorsport.com. The very first comment that was left implied British bias. British bias was then mentioned twice in the comment thread. I then went to Autosport, where the same article had been posted, because motorsport.com and Autosport, they're owned by the same people, and I encountered pretty much the same pieces of word salad. Josh Suttle at the race pointed out that both McLaren and Ferrari were running the same spec of rear wing that they'd been using at the Belgian Grand Prix. Smaller rear wings than what Red Bull were running, but a tiny bit bigger than what the race-winning car of Hamilton had. As such, the McLaren and Ferrari were very equal in terms of performance, but the McLaren had that slight edge when the car had its mini DRS activated. But it's not like the McLaren was constantly going 10 to 15 kilometers an hour faster all the time. In the race, the FIA's official maximum speed for Piastri as he crossed the finish line was 341 kilometers an hour, above only Bottas and Tsunoda, so he was one of the slowest cars in a straight line out there. Leclerc's fastest speed over the line was 346 kilometers an hour. In the designated speed trap, Piastri was at 328.8, Leclerc 325.5. But where the difference between Leclerc getting by or not was evident was at the end of the straights. Oscar had just enough top speed with this mini DRS to not allow Leclerc a slam dunk overtake. What it allowed Piastri to do was keep Leclerc trapped in that 1 second bubble and make the Ferrari eat its tyres. Given that Leclerc hadn't done much hard running, if any hard running, due to his practice crash, it was playing into Oscar's hands. So it looks like McLaren have found some sort of hole in the rulebook or grey area in the rulebook that nobody else seems to have found. And the bit that everybody seems to be quoting online at the minute is Article 3.10 of the FIA Technical Regulations. Basically, everything that governs the rear wing assembly. 3.9 is the front wing assembly. The armchair aerodynamicist's favourite part of the rulebook is easily found, along with all the other rules, in the FIA's technical regulations, and they can be viewed at your leisure on the FIA's own website, along with rulebooks from previous years which are really cool, and I've used several of these in my storytime videos when the need arises. And what's even better is, whenever the rulebook is updated, they put the previous one up so you can read them both and see how the wording has changed. So, 3.10 of the technical regulations is all to do with the rear wing assembly, the DRS system, and everything else that can be put into that little bubble. It's also written in a manner that makes my scripts, with super long sentences that sometimes have very little in the way of commas and stuff, look brilliant. It's all in legalese. 3.10.10 is the one that I've seen quoted the most, which is everything to do with the drag reduction system and the different parts that the FIA has written in to make sure that nobody tries to take the mickey with opening the rear flap more than they say they can open the rear flap. But in 3.10.6, the FIA's wording states that the rear wing must be attached to 3 pairs of rigid impervious supports and gives the locations of where those supports can be. These pairs of supports must be designed and arranged such that the 2 closed sections and the relationship between them can only change whilst the car is in motion and in accordance with Article 3.10.10, the bit that regulates the DRS system. But it then has several extra points labelled A through to J. Section D, lol, of that portion says that any curvature only occurs on the horizontal plane, except for when the DRS is open, and section I of that little bit says that the rear wing plane in the closed position must be rigidly fixed to its respective section, which, okay, is always going to generate discussion because people assume rigid to mean this stuff cannot move, when it has to move, otherwise it will break under load, as I've explained several times. Section I goes on to say that where the rear wing flaps are fixed, a fillet radius of no greater than 4mm will be permitted between the support and the rear wing profiles or the rear wing tip. I'm no expert, and I don't claim to be, but I reckon that whole section from A through to J in 3.10.6 is the bit that McLaren have exploited. The rules allow for 4mm permitted on that fillet, but it's estimated that the gap that developed in the rear wing was around 0.8 of an inch, or just over 2 centimeters, which is 20mm. But at the same time, there's stuff about not exceeding 45 degrees on a y-axis and other bits and pieces. Now you might understand this way better than I do. I've probably gone the wrong way about all of this, I'm having the wrong thought processes, and I'm just going down completely the wrong path with trying to arrive at the conclusions that I'm arriving at, but that's why I'm not an F1 engineer. I'm just a fat bloke that finds it incredibly interesting, but I will leave the technical regulations in the description for you, the 2024 technical regulations from July of this year, which is when it was last updated, so you can read all of that at your leisure. I was up most of last night reading them. I went to bed quite late. But I went on another dive into the next part of the rulebook to read more on what is contained within 3.10.10. One bit that sticks out for me is points G and H within that section. G saying that any alteration of the incidence of the uppermost closed section may only be commanded by direct driver input and controlled by the control electronics specified in Article 8.3, which is basically how to open the DRS system. Then, in H, at any Y-plane, the distance between the 2 sections of the rear wing profiles at their closest position must lie between 10mm and 85mm. 2 centimeters, that 0.8 of an inch, is more than 10mm and less than 85mm. So at 140 miles an hour or so, McLaren's rear wing is within that 10mm minimum, but as the car goes beyond that, or whatever speed it's going to, it opens up to the 20mm we saw at Baku, and that gives you that more visible gap and a little bit of a straight line boost. I don't know, it's something for you to discuss. Like I said, I'm no expert. But video evidence shows that McLaren has been running something like this for several races now. The YouTube user YeListener, I hope I got that correct, has shown that at Baku, Monza and Spa, McLaren has used some variation of this trick rear wing to generate some straight line speed while still running a larger rear wing. They'll have the downforce when they need it, but when it opens up, the drag is going to be on par with the teams running smaller assemblies, and they'll be producing relatively equal top speeds, which will then translate into an advantage in the corners, for McLaren that is. It's a little like that thing a few years ago that Mercedes had with the rear suspension, where it basically collapsed above a certain speed, and that resulted in less drag in a straight line, with the ride height going back up for the corners so the rear would roll better and generate turn-in. So I guess how you feel about all of this will depend on who you support. There's bound to be the standard issue, if this was Red Bull everybody would be screaming that it's cheating, or something like that. But those same people would be saying that it's the genius of Adrian Newey if Red Bull had been using anything like it over the last couple of years, and everybody else just has to cope harder. It does kind of show that maybe the FIA needs to step up its stress testing a little bit, but as it stands, they found nothing wrong with the rear wing, in the same way they found nothing wrong with the front wings. Maybe it's because McLaren haven't been that dominant yet. Maybe if McLaren gets too far ahead, they'll wind it in and issue a technical directive. But at the same time, they might just be collecting the data now, ready to bin it all off in 2026. With one more year of this regulation cycle and not long left this season, it might be one of those things they'll allow for now and get rid of it when the regulations reset. But that'll be a when we see it happen type of thing. But as it stands, if the other teams want to beat McLaren, they might have to join them. And with Formula 1 heading into the final portion of the season, is it even worth it? Especially with all the limited spending that they have these days. Legal but cheeky is how I would describe it. If it gets banned, it gets banned. But it doesn't detract from the fact that it is a genius idea. A small thing, quite literally, to gain a few tenths. But if it does remain legal, the other teams are going to have to seriously think about developing their own. So then, a look at the stuff surrounding McLaren's rear wing that has been generating discussion online since the end of the Grand Prix in Azerbaijan at the weekend. If the things I've said over the course of this video have been interesting and maybe also given you some ideas of your own, then do leave this video one of those like things so I know a good job was done. And for more stuff like this and anything else to do around here, get subscribed if you're not already subscribed, and also get the bell on so you never miss out on any future talking head performances. Massive thanks as ever to the fine folk at Patreon that support the channel at a more personal level, and if you want to help keep things running around here, then a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know. Well, there's super thanks if you want to buy me a coffee, and there's memberships if you think that Patreon is a bit too scary and you want to keep things contained to YouTube. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.